Today, I'm going to explain the price consumption curve. Let's assume that the consumer consumes two goods, food and clothing. Also, assume that the price of food is $1 and the price of clothing to be $2 and the consumer's income is $20. Now, have a look at this figure where x-axis represents the units of food consumed per month and y-axis represents the units of clothing consumed per month. And assume that initially the consumer's utility maximizing consumption choice is at point B here. So, the consumer buys 12 units of food and 4 units of clothing, thus achieving the level of utility associated with indifference curve U2. So, the consumer is at budget line KM. At the same time, the figure here shows the relationship between the price of food and its quantity demanded. The horizontal axis measures the quantity of food consumed and the vertical axis measures the price of food. The figure essentially shows the demand curve of food. We have assumed that the price of food is $1 and the consumer consumes 12 units of food. The consumer is at point G on the demand curve. So, at this point G, he is consuming 12 units of food and the price per unit of food is assumed to be $1. Now, suppose that the price of food increases to $2. At $1, the units of food consumed were 12 and the consumer was at budget line KM and the optimal consumption point was at B. That is, he was at indifference curve U2 on point B. As the price of food increases, the budget line rotates inward towards KL as the purchasing power of the consumer declines. The consumer now achieves maximum utility at A, which is found on a lower indifference curve U1. This is because the price of food has risen and the consumer's purchasing power has fallen. At A, the consumer chooses 4 units of food and 6 units of clothing. When we look at figure B, at the new price of food, that is $2, 4 units of food is demanded. We can see that the units of food consumed has declined when compared with what he consumed when the price of food was $1. But now, with the price of food being $2, the consumer's modified consumption choice is at E. Now, suppose that the price of food decreases to $0.5. Then, the budget line rotates outward to Kn in figure A as the level of purchasing power increases and the consumer can achieve the higher level of utility associated with indifference curve U3 with the consumer consuming 20 units of food and 5 units of clothing. In figure B, the consumer reaches point H on the demand curve as he consumes 20 units of food at $0.5. In figure A, we have traced the utility maximizing combinations of food and clothing associated with every possible price of food. So, it shows the utility maximizing combinations associated with the change in the price of food keeping the price of clothing constant. This is nothing but the price consumption curve, which is the curve tracing the utility maximizing combinations of two goods as the price of one good changes. Here, it traces the utility maximizing combinations of food and clothing associated with every possible price of food. As the price of food falls, attainable utility increases and the consumer buys more food. We can understand that from the downward sloping demand curve. But the question arises as to what happens to the consumption of clothing as the price of food falls. When the price of food is at $2, the consumer consumes 6 units of clothing as can be seen in the figure. That is when he is in indifference curve U1. When the price of food declines to $1, that is, when he reaches indifference curve U2, the consumer can be seen to be purchasing 4 units of clothing. When the price of food further declines to $0.5, the consumer reaches indifference curve U3 and he purchases 5 units of clothing. So, it can be observed that the consumption of clothing may either increase or decrease as the price of food falls, because the consumption of clothing decreased when the price of food fell from $2 to $1, and the consumption of clothing increased when the price of food fell from $1 to $0.5. An individual demand curve relates the quantity of a good that a single consumer will buy to the price of that good. In figure B, the individual demand curve relates the quantity of food that the consumer will buy and to the price of food. This demand curve has two important properties. The level of utility that can be attained changes as we move along the curve. The lower the price of the product, the higher the level of utility. We can see from figure A that higher indifference curve is reached as the price of food falls. Again, this result simply reflects the fact that as the price of a product falls, the consumer's purchasing power increases. At every point on the demand curve, the consumer is maximizing utility by satisfying the condition that the marginal rate of substitution of food for clothing equals the ratio of the prices of food and clothing. I'll explain this in detail. As the price of the food falls, the price ratio falls. The price ratio is nothing but the ratio of the price of food to the price of clothing. When the consumer is at point E, the price of food is $2. Note that we assumed the price of clothing to be $2, which remains constant throughout. So, only the price of food changes. So, at point E, the price ratio will be $2 divided by $2, that is, price of food divided by price of clothing. At the same time, at point G, the price of food is $1 and the price of clothing is $2. Here, the price ratio will be 1 divided by 2. Then, at point H, the price of food changes to $0.5 and the price of clothing is $2. So, the price ratio is 0.5 divided by 2, which is 1 by 4. When we learned about indifference curves, we learned that MRS, or marginal rate of substitution, is a measure of the maximum amount of one good that the consumer is willing to give up in order to obtain 1 unit of another good. And the consumer maximizes his satisfaction when the MRS is equal to the price ratio. Here, the consumer is maximizing his utility at points E, G, and H. As you saw, the MRS varies along the individual's demand curve. This tells us how the consumers value the consumption of a good or service as the price of one good changes. Because the MRS of food for clothing is $1 at E, this means that one additional unit of food is worth one additional unit of clothing. But the cost for a unit of clothing remains unchanged at $2, which is the value or the marginal benefit obtained by consuming an additional unit of food. Thus, as we move down the demand curve at point G, the MRS falls. Likewise, the value that the consumer places on an additional unit of food still falls as the price of food reaches $0.5. So, in short, as the price of food falls, the MRS of food for clothing falls as we go down the demand curve. I hope this concept is clear. Thank you.